When Director Owen Mercer walked into the emergency wing after the crash, he expected chaos. What he found was something far worse. 57 critically injured survivors, every single one of them stabilized, and a hallway full of exhausted staff standing in complete silence. He turned to the nearest nurse, a young woman whose hands were still trembling, and demanded to know who had managed all of this. She didn't meet his eyes when she answered. She just pointed toward the exit doors and said quietly that it had been the nurse they suspended that morning. Lena Price. The woman security had walked out of the building that same morning. If this is your first time here, stories like this one are what this channel is about. Real human moments where everything that matters gets stripped down to its core. If that's something you want more of, hitting subscribe takes 1 second, and it means you won't miss what comes next. Lena Price had worked the emergency department at Ridgeway Memorial for 11 years. And in all that time, she had never once put her name on a success that wasn't entirely hers to claim. When a patient walked out alive, she felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done exactly what they came to do. She didn't need the attending physician to turn around and say, "Well done." She didn't need the charge nurse to mention her name in the debrief. The work itself was enough, and that had always been enough. What most of her colleagues didn't know, and what Lena had never offered, was that she had spent 4 years as a combat medic before she ever set foot in a civilian hospital. She had triaged casualties in conditions that no textbook prepared anyone for, in places where the difference between a correct decision and a hesitation was measured in heartbeats. When she came home, she didn't talk about it. Not because it was too painful, but because she understood that the moment she mentioned it, people would start listening to her differently, filtering everything she said through the lens of that history, rather than judging it on its own merit. She wanted to be heard for what she knew now, not given credit for what she had survived before. Dr. Corbin Vale was the kind of man who had built his entire professional identity around the architecture of the hospital system. Its hierarchies, its protocols, its chain of command. He wasn't cruel by nature, and he genuinely believed that the structures he upheld were what kept patients safe. But somewhere along the way, that belief had calcified into something less noble. He had stopped being able to distinguish between a protocol that protected a patient and a protocol that protected his own authority. That distinction mattered enormously when lives were on the line. He and Lena had circled each other for years without open conflict. There had been moments where she suggested differently, and he overrode her, and she turned out to have been right, but neither of them had pushed it far enough to force a confrontation. Until that morning, the patient was a man in his mid-50s, brought in after collapsing at his office. The preliminary scans were inconclusive, the chest X-ray unremarkable, and his vitals sat in a range that was technically acceptable. Dr. Vale reviewed the results, ordered a second round of blood work, and noted in the chart that they would reassess in 40 minutes. It was a reasonable decision by every standard the hospital recognized. Lena read the chart, looked at the man lying in Bay 4, and felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with her own body. She had seen this before, not in a textbook, not in a simulation, but in the field, in the particular way a person's skin loses its color. Not all at once, but slowly, almost politely, as though the body is apologizing for what it's about to do. The man's pressure was holding, but his pulse had a quality she didn't like, a subtle irregularity that the monitors hadn't flagged yet, because the algorithm wasn't designed to catch what her hands already knew. She went to find Dr. Vale. She found him at the nurse's station reviewing another chart, and she told him calmly that she believed the patient in Bay 4 was bleeding internally. She said that waiting 40 minutes was going to cost him his life. Dr. Vale didn't look up immediately. When he did, his expression wasn't angry. It was the particular brand of patience that people deploy when they've already decided not to take something seriously. He told her that the scans showed no evidence of internal hemorrhage. He said the protocol existed for exactly this kind of situation. He appreciated her concern, but the decision had been made. Lena stood there for a moment and understood something clearly. He wasn't dismissing her read of the patient. He was dismissing the idea that her read of the patient could matter more than his. Those were two entirely different things. Only one of them could be resolved with more data. She went back to Bay 4. She checked the patient's pulse again. She made the call herself. She bypassed the attending's order. She contacted the rapid response team directly. She had the patient move toward the OR. Before Dr. Vale had finished his next chart note, the surgical team opened him up and found active internal bleeding that would have been catastrophic within the hour. The patient survived. Dr. Vale was informed of this while Lena was still outside the OR. What happened next had nothing to do with the patient's outcome. It had everything to do with what it meant that she had been right. He didn't come to find her privately. He came to the main floor where 2 other nurses and a resident were present. He told her that what she had done was a direct violation of the hospital's chain of command. He said it didn't matter whether the outcome was positive. A system only functions when people operate within their defined roles. His voice was controlled. But there was something underneath it that wasn't about the system at all. Lena recognized it because she had heard it before, in other voices, in other places. The sound of a person who has confused their authority with their identity. A person who cannot separate a challenge to one from a threat to the other. She didn't argue. She had learned a long time ago that arguing in that moment in front of those people would only give him more material to work with. She listened. When he finished, she handed over her badge. She picked up the personal items from her station without being asked. A security officer walked her to the elevator and out through the lobby. She carried a small cardboard box, a coffee mug, a spare pen, a photograph she kept taped to the inside of her locker. She walked out into the parking lot and stood beside her car in the morning light. She wasn't crying. She wasn't shaking. She was doing what she had trained herself to do in the aftermath, decisions that couldn't be undone. Simply be present in the moment. Not try to solve anything until the noise in her head had quieted down enough to think clearly. She had been right, and she had been punished for it. Both of those things were true at the same time. She was old enough to know that the world didn't always reconcile them neatly. She set the cardboard box on the hood of her car and looked at it. The photograph on top was of a group of people she had served with overseas. Their faces were sun-damaged and squinting into a desert noon. None of them would have been surprised by what had just happened to her. They would have recognized it immediately, the particular injury of being seen as a problem by the people you were trying to protect. The sirens started as a single sound in the distance. Within seconds, they became many. Lena turned toward the hospital entrance. She watched the first ambulance cut across the parking lot, then a second, then a third, then a military transport vehicle that had no business being this far from a base. A news helicopter appeared over the tree line to the east. She had heard about a cargo plane going down near the city that morning. It had only been mentioned briefly on the radio during her commute. She hadn't thought about it again until right now, watching the emergency vehicles pour in, understanding the math of what was unfolding with the kind of cold clarity that only came from having seen it before. A young soldier came running out of the ambulance bay doors. He was still wearing a blood-soaked sleeve. He scanned the parking lot with the expression of someone who needed help and would take it from anyone still standing. He spotted Lena. He saw her scrubs. He noticed her posture. He realized she was the only person outside who wasn't moving away from the building. He ran straight toward her. He told her they needed everyone. He said it was bad. People were going to die if there weren't enough hands. He didn't know she had been suspended that morning. He didn't know about Dr. Vale. He didn't know about the chain of command. He didn't know about the cardboard box sitting on the hood of her car. He simply saw someone who looked like they knew what they were doing. He asked her to come back inside. Lena looked at the box. She thought about the photograph. She thought about the people in it. She thought about what any one of them would have done if they had been standing where she was standing. She thought about the patients being unloaded from those vehicles right now. People who had boarded a plane that morning with no idea it would be the last ordinary thing they ever did. None of them had anything to do with what Dr. Vale had decided about her. None of them deserved to pay for it. She picked up the box. She set it on the ground beside her rear tire. She walked back toward the hospital entrance at a pace that was not quite a run, but left no doubt about her direction. The security officer who had walked her out 20 minutes earlier was now stationed at the ambulance bay, managing the incoming flow of patients. He saw her coming. He took in the coming minutes' prom situation around him. He stepped aside without a word. There was no authority left to enforce in a moment like this. He knew it. The emergency department looked nothing like it did on any other morning. Gurneys filled the hallway in both directions. Some were pushed against the walls. Some were left at angles where the teams had simply run out of room to maneuver. The floor near the ambulance bay doors was wet. Part of it was rain tracked in from outside. Part of it was fluids that had dripped from IV lines pulled loose during transport. Monitors beeped from 3 directions at once. Underneath all of it was the sound Lena had learned to recognize above everything else. The sound of people who were not making any noise at all. She moved through the doors. She took in the room the way she had been trained, not person by person, but as a whole. She read the shape of the crisis before focusing on any single part of it. What she saw confirmed what she had already suspected from the parking lot. The staff was working hard, but they were working in the wrong order. A resident near the entrance was triaging patients by the sequence they arrived. That was the instinct of someone trained in normal emergency medicine. It was exactly the wrong approach when the volume exceeded the department's capacity to treat everyone simultaneously. 3 of the loudest patients were receiving the most attention. A man lying against the far wall, with a grey pallor and barely perceptible chest movement, had not been reached yet. Lena went to him first. She checked his pulse. She pulled back his jacket. She immediately found the source of what was happening to Tim. She turned to the nearest nurse. It was a young woman she recognized from the morning shift, named Jamie. Lena told her clearly that this patient needed blood. He needed it immediately. He was in hemorrhagic shock. The quieter he was, the worse his condition actually was. Jamie moved without questioning her. That told Lena at least some of the staff had already reached the point where they would follow whoever sounded like they knew what they were doing. From that moment on, Lena stopped waiting for permission. She called out instructions across the department. She spoke the way she had once spoken across much louder and far more dangerous ground. Not loudly enough to add to the noise, but with a precision that cut through this patient to the oar immediately. That one can wait another 15 minutes. The woman in Bay 2 is developing a tension pneumothorax. She needs a needle before she needs anything else. The teenage boy near the window is in more danger than his wound suggests. His blood pressure has been dropping slowly for several minutes. No one has noticed the trend. A few members of the staff hesitated, not because they doubted her judgment, because word had already spread that she had been suspended that morning. Technically, she had no authority to give anyone orders. Lena understood their hesitation. She didn't argue. She didn't stop to explain herself. She simply kept moving. She kept making decisions. She kept being right in ways that everyone could immediately verify. After the third or fourth correct call, the hesitation disappeared on its own. Authority during a crisis wasn't a badge. It wasn't a title. It was the accumulation of decisions that saved lives. About 30 minutes after Lena returned, Dr. Vale appeared at the entrance to the emergency department. He stood there and surveyed the room. The first thing he saw was Lena standing in the center of the department. She was directing patients and staff with the calm confidence of someone who clearly belonged there. She looked nothing like a person who had been escorted out of the building less than an hour earlier. His expression shifted quickly. Recognition. Disbelief. Then the familiar mask of institutional authority returned. He started walking toward her. Before he could reach her, a wounded soldier being helped down the hallway by 2 orderlies looked up. The moment he saw Lena, he stopped. He was a young man, maybe 22 years old. A compression bandage wrapped around his left leg had already soaked through with blood. Even with 2 people supporting him, he straightened as much as his body would allow. He looked directly at Lena. He spoke her name the way soldiers speak the names of people who once pulled them back from death. Sergeant Price. The hallway didn't become silent all at once. The silence spread like a wave. People closest to the soldier heard him first, then everyone else. Dr. Vale stopped walking. The resident who had been triaging patients by arrival order looked up from his clipboard. Jamie turned her head without letting go of the IV line she was inserting. Nobody spoke. The soldiers' words had explained everything. Without anyone realizing it, the nurse, doctor, Vale had dismissed as someone who didn't know her place had survived experiences none of them had imagined. She had worked in situations far more demanding than this hospital. She possessed abilities far beyond what her job title suggested. Doctor Vale didn't take another step toward her. He remained exactly where he was. For the first time that day, he had absolutely nothing to say. He was still chief of surgery. He still outranked everyone in the room according to every official rule the hospital recognized. But something inside that room had changed. Everyone could feel it. Dr. Vale understood it too. He didn't leave. He also didn't interfere. Instead, he quietly moved to one side of the hallway. He began coordinating supplies. He communicated with the surgical suites upstairs. He focused on tasks that genuinely helped. He never announced what he was doing. It wasn't a dramatic act of redemption. It was simply the smallest version of doing the right thing. The staff noticed. Lena never looked at him. She was already focused on the next patient. The next hour became even harder. The first wave of casualties had been survivable because Lena redirected the entire system before it collapsed. As more patients continued arriving, exhaustion began creating new problems. The weak points appeared in different places. A surgical suite running 3 operations at once reached a bottleneck when 2 procedures suddenly became far more complicated than expected. Critical supplies that should have been restocked an hour earlier were gone. One nurse lost several valuable minutes searching for another defibrillator after the battery in the first one failed. Jamie was the one who finally broke. Lena saw it coming before anyone else did. The young nurse had been holding herself together through sheer determination. But determination has limits. Jamie reached hers while standing beside a patient who needed an IV restarted. A crash cart checked, and a frantic family member escorted out of the room all at the same time. She suddenly began crying. Not quietly, not gracefully, the kind of uncontrollable crying that happens when someone has pushed beyond every limit and the body simply refuses to keep pretending everything is fine. Lena crossed the room in 4 quick steps. She didn't put a comforting hand on Jamie's shoulder. She didn't tell her everything would be okay. That wasn't what the moment required. Instead, she stood directly in Jamie's line of sight. Her voice was calm, firm, kind, but it left absolutely no room for hesitation. Jamie, I need you in basics. They need you to hold that IV line. You can fall apart when this is over. I'll sit beside you while you do. But right now, basics can't wait. Jamie took one long, ragged breath. She nodded. Then she turned and hurried back to basics. What Lena was doing went far beyond treating one patient after another. She was managing an entire system under impossible conditions. Exactly as she had done overseas. She identified weak points before they became disasters. She constantly decided where limited people, limited equipment, and limited time would save the greatest number of lives. That wasn't a skill listed anywhere in her nursing job description. It wasn't something taught during nursing school. It wasn't covered in continuing education courses. It had been forged through experience. Experience that almost nobody inside this hospital knew she possessed, and that experience was the only reason the emergency department was still functioning. Late that afternoon, the final group of patients arrived. 5 survivors were transported together from the far end of the crash site. It had taken rescue teams much longer to reach them. 2 of those patients were critically injured. The first was a young soldier. A severe chest injury had left him, unable to breathe on his own. The second was a man in his late 40s. He had suffered a traumatic brain injury. He was slipping in and out of consciousness. Each time he faded, the chances of recovery became smaller. There was only one ventilator available. Lena stood between both patients. She immediately understood the impossible decision before her. Protocols could provide guidance. Policies could offer a framework. But no rule book could make this decision. Only the person standing in front of those 2 patients could do that. She studied the young soldier. Then she examined the older man. She absorbed everything she could in the few seconds she had. Not everything. No one ever has enough time in moments like these. But she saw more than anyone else in the room could have seen. She assigned the ventilator to the soldier. Then she instructed the second medical team to begin an alternative treatment protocol. It carried a lower chance of survival. But it wasn't hopeless. No one questioned her. Not a single person. Some of them probably couldn't explain why. They simply knew they had watched Lena make one correct decision after another throughout the entire day. That record had earned something more valuable than rank. It had earned trust. Lena also understood something else. Whether this decision had truly been the right one would only become clear much later. She didn't stay to wonder about it. Another patient needed her. There was always another patient. Standing still was never an option.